Hello everyone, it's Angelika Kargulewicz, clinical nutritionist, and in today's episode we will talk about a very unpleasant condition. What to do when we encounter in our life diarrhea, what to eat, and what is the most important action which we can take when we suffer from this condition. If you are interested in this kind of situation and how to cope with this difficult condition, please stay with me today. Diarrhea is a very unpleasant situation, but can be also very dangerous to both health and life. And those most at risk of diarrhea-related consequences are young children and elderly people. The most dangerous consequence of diarrhea is dehydration, so the first thing to do is make sure that you drink enough fluids. The question is, what other food should necessarily be eaten? If you are interested in what should be necessary on your plate if you suffer from diarrhea, I invite you to today's episode. To begin with, it is worth answering the question, what is diarrhea anyway? Because one loose bowel movement per day does not necessarily indicate diarrhea. The problem arises when there are such a loose bowel movements like 3 or more per day, and the so-called acute diarrhea lasts less than 7 days and no more than 14 days. Indeed, diarrhea can be dangerous both in the form of immediate consequences like dehydration and circulatory disorders, but also in the form of distant consequences, mainly with chronic diarrhea. And in that kind of situation, there is a risk of nutritional deficiencies. So the first important action when it comes to dealing with diarrhea is hydration, and optimally it should be used Oral Rehydration Solutions, so-called ORS, and it should be dissolved in boiled and cooled water, and it contains electrolytes like sodium and potassium chloride, but also sodium bicarbonate and glucose. In adults, it is required usually to drink 500 to 1000 milliliters within first 4 hours when the diarrhea occurs, and then about 200 milliliters after each loose and liquid stool. Feeding should be started as soon as possible, as it shortens the duration of the diarrhea, and it is very important and necessary for the proper regeneration of the intestinal cells and also for the proper functioning of the intestinal microbiota. And the question is, which food products are especially advisable when we have the problem with diarrhea? For sure, slightly green bananas, because they contain much more starch than fructans, unlike the overripe ones, which in turn can increase the intestinal peristaltic movement. So if you encounter diarrhea, it is good to incorporate into your diet slightly green bananas with the starch, which heals the intestinal cells. There even exists something like plantain, which is a green banana meal. It is rich in resistant starch, which resists the digestion in the small intestine and ferments in the colon, feeding the beneficial gut bacteria. This fermentation synthesizes the short-chain fatty acids, especially butyrate. Butyrate enhances the colonic mucosal health. It promotes the absorption of the fluid and electrolytes and also minimizes the stool frequency and output. And it is worth to mention that plantain has a low osmolarity, which means that it helps the body to retain the water and electrolytes and also is very helpful in reducing the severity of the diarrhea. Another recommended food product for people with diarrhea is cooked rice, but mainly the lower fiber rice, like for example white rice, parboiled, jasmine, arborio or basmati rice. Otherwise, the rice types like for example white rice, brown, red, for example black rice or brown rice, they are not advisable. Why? Because they contain too much, especially insoluble dietary fiber. Another recommended food product during diarrhea is unsweetened tapioca pudding. It is derived from the cassava plant. It is composed of highly digestible starch, very gentle on the digestive tract, bland and also low residue, easy to digest and also ideal during the gastrointestinal distress, and also helps to provide calories and fluids during diarrhea in a very soothing form. And another advisable food product are cooked apples. They are even a part of so-called brat diet, the classic anti-diarrhea diet. But it is very important that this is not about sugary apple mousses, because sugar and added sugar in this case can even aggravate the fermentation and promote diarrhea. So we talk about pure cooked apples, not about the sugary mousses made from apples. Another advisable food products are, for example, cooked carrots, for example, in the form of the carrot soup, but also cooked celery, swede, or potatoes. They contain a very gentle starch, pectins, and electrolytes, so helpful during the diarrhea. Another advisable dish is black dried berry jelly. Why? Because berries, like for example bilberry, is high in tannins, which are very advisable in the course of the diarrhea. And when we talk about different kinds of the fluids, of course the hydration is very important, but besides the water and also rehydration solution, we can use cocoa powder, but on the water, not on the milk, because milk and its lactose content can even worsen the diarrhea. So when it comes to the fluids, it is good to prepare cocoa but on the water. And when it comes to the minerals, some of them can be even useful in the course of the diarrhea. For example, zinc, but other can be very harmful. For example, higher doses of the magnesium, because high dose of the magnesium can even cause loose bowel movement. So we should be aware of it and remember when we experience, for example, diarrhea, if we do not exaggerate with the magnesium supplementation. And what else can be very useful when it comes to diarrhea? For sure, probiotics. And according to the global recommendations, for example, due to the World Gastroenterology Organization, probiotics are safe and effective in the prevention, but also in the relief of diarrhea of various types. For example, acute infectious diarrhea, but also post-antibiotic diarrhea, and even diarrhea associated with radiotherapy. But we should also remember that the properties of the probiotics are strain dependent. What does it mean in the practice? So we should choose the proper strain. And for example, when it comes to the effectiveness during the diarrhea, very effective strains are non-pathogenic yeast like Saccharomyces boulardii, but also, for example, Lactobacillus rhamnosus GG. There's also a growing scientific evidence that fermented foods can be also very helpful when it comes to the prevention, but also helping treat diarrhea. And we should here ingest, for example, fermented food like fermented dairy food products, but also traditional pickles. And its effectiveness is due to the presence of the lactic fermentation bacteria. And which is very important, I would say that crucial here, because as your well-being improves, try to expand your diet as soon as possible to a balanced and very nutritious diet. And if your diarrhea is chronic, for example, lasts longer than 14 days, it is worth looking for a cause, for example, in the form of the intestinal disorders or diseases, like for example celiac disease, or for example different kind of disturbances, like for example SIBO, which is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or for example in the form of the food intolerances, for example in the form of the lactose intolerance. In conclusion, diarrhea, particularly dangerous due to the risk of the dehydration, requires a prompt rehydration, ideally in the form of the oral rehydration solutions, but it also requires the early reintroduction of the gut-soothing food products that help the recovery and also help to restore the intestinal barrier and the intestinal well-being. The recommended food products include green bananas or, for example, plantain flour, rich in resistant starch, but also white rice, tapioca, cooked apples and vegetables, but also bilberry jelly and, for example, probiotics, but very specific one like Saccharomyces boulardii or Lactobacillus rhamnosus GG. As symptoms improve, the diet should be gradually expanded, but the chronic diarrhea warrants the further investigation into the underlying causes such as intolerances or gut disorders. Thank you for watching my video. If you like it, please leave the thumb up, subscribe the channel and see you soon in the next episode.